This is your official welcome to our second faculty salon of this year's Deep Read program on Tommy Orange's novel, There, There. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sound is good? Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm Laura Martin. I'm a lecturer at Porter College, and I teach here at UC Santa Cruz at Porter as well as in the literature department. I'm teaching the undergraduate Deep Read class this year on Tommy Orange, or this quarter rather. And I also work at the Humanities Institute on the Deep Read program. Tonight, as I'm sure you know, we're going to hear presentations from 3 UC Santa Cruz professors, Keliiaa, Mayanthi Fernando, and Renya Ramirez, followed by a Q&A where we invite you to ask questions, which you can put in the chat, or you can simply speak out, or you can raise your electronic hand, whatever you'd like to do. So many options in Zoom. If you missed our first faculty salon last Thursday with UC Santa Cruz literature professors Mika Perks and Jennifer Sung on craft and There, not to worry, we have a recording, and we'll be sending the recordings out along with the recording for this event and a recording for our salon, our next salon and our final salon that's going to be tomorrow evening with the Amamutsit Tribal Band. It will be at the same time as tonight's from 5:30 to 7. And so the idea is we'll send an email out with links to everything that you can catch if you miss any of those. Let's see. We also, of course, hope that you'll join us for Tommy Orange's virtual visit to campus, which is going to happen a week from tonight, March 3rd at 6:30 p.m., where he's going to be in conversation with Mika Perks about his novel and about, whatever else comes up. So before I turn things over to our speakers tonight, I want to say a few words about the Deep Read Initiative and the partners that make it all possible for us to be here together tonight. As I'm sure many of you know, the Deep Read is a program of the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz. If you aren't already signed up for THI, our newsletter, please do consider joining our mailing list, which you can do by visiting our homepage and scrolling all the way down to the very bottom. And you can put your name in and sign up that way. We send out weekly emails with various humanities events that we sponsor, co-sponsor, and just think are interesting. We often feature humanities faculty and students that are doing interesting research and work on campus and beyond. The Deep Read program itself is made possible through the generous support of the Helen and Will Webster Foundation, as well as through our community partnerships with the Amamutsit Tribal Band and Bookshop Santa Cruz. We also have campus partnerships as well that make this possible. The American Indian Resource Center, Porter College, the College Scholars Program, the Division of Student Success, the UCSC Council of Provosts, the University Library, and University Relations. So now, with all of that said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Katie Keliiaa is an assistant professor of feminist studies here at UC Santa Cruz. She's an indigenous feminist historian focused on the interdisciplinary fields of Native American studies, labor studies, feminist studies, and critical race and ethnic studies. Her scholarship engages in Indian labor exploitation, dispossession, and the surveillance of Native bodies, especially in Native Californian contexts. Her book, Unsettling Domesticity, examines how Native women domestic workers negotiated and challenged an early 20th century Indian labor program. In this work, Dr. Keliiaa centers Native women's voices uncovered from federal archives. Her forthcoming publications include articles on indigenous geographies of resistance and Native language reclamation. I'll hand it over to you, Katie. And I'll just ask, sorry to interrupt you, if everyone could mute themselves, that would help us hear Professor Keliiaa all the better. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. I think it's really exciting to be a part of this. And as a fan of There, I'm really excited to share a little bit about my take on this particular book. So I was born and raised in Hayward, California, so East Bay all the way. That's an experience that I think really comes up a lot in this particular text. And in my youth, I worked for the American Indian Child Resource Center in Oakland. So I really got to learn sort of the firsthand experiences that a lot of youth in Oakland experience, as well as families in Oakland, which I think is a fairly central theme to this particular book. And a little bit about how I come into this is actually related to my research. So as an urban Indian person, an urban Indian woman, one of the things that I do in my research is I look at something called the Bay Area Outing Program. And this is a program that ran in the Bay Area from about 1920 to about 1940. And its sole purpose was to essentially get Native women from Western-based boarding schools to work as live-in housemaids in homes throughout the Bay Area. So this is like Berkeley, Oakland, Piedmont, as well as even on the other side of the Bay in San Francisco, San Bruno, et cetera. So that particular program, I look at kind of the ways that Native women were able to frustrate a very entrenched labor program, but I also look at the ways that they were able to build community. And there's an organization that's really linked to this called the Four Winds Club. And that particular organization had a lot of sort of development, particularly in the 40s, as it wasn't just Native domestic workers who were part of this organization, but then later, men who were enlisted in World War I, as well as Native students at Berkeley and Stanford, et cetera. So in this very particular history, we begin to see how Native people are quite literally creating an urban Indian community well before it's even imagined to happen. So some of you may be familiar with something called urban Indian relocation, which really happened in the 50s and the 60s, sometimes in even later cases. And part of this book brings together that history. We start to see how urban Indian centers sort of pop up across the Bay Area, health centers, for instance, too, and how things like a big powwow might also happen in the Bay Area. So this sort of experience about creating community and really thinking about Indigenous futures as well is happening. So even though I'm a historian, I think about how the community that was created in the 20s, 30s, and 40s then becomes a community that we see today in this particular book. So that's just a little bit about how I particularly come into this text. And what I really appreciate is that, the urban Indian identity is something that's not really explored in many texts altogether. I could kind of count on my hands some of the scholarly texts that take up urban Indian identity, particularly in the Bay Area. And, we're really lucky to have Renya Ramirez here, who quite literally wrote a book on, urban Indian community and identity here in the Bay Area. So I can't wait to hear that particular perspective. But we don't really see that. So when this book dropped, it was really wonderful and incredible to sort of see a community that I know very well, a community that I'm a part of, reflected on the page. So I knew that, coming from my experience, one of the first events that happened, I think it was in 2018, around just the end of the summer, Tommy did a particular event at Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland. And it was really exciting to see the support and people really wanting to see what was the story that you told about us in a way, right? And so I think I really enjoyed seeing that. And I think there's a lot of characters in the book that I can kind of identify with and understand. So for instance, I'm very familiar with a Native person who maybe was adopted out at a young age and is trying to connect with their family. I'm also familiar with Native aunties who raise their nieces and nephews as their own, and also thinking about blended families, right? And families that have experienced violence, for instance. So these kind of aspects mean that when I stepped into there, I automatically knew the terrain. I knew sort of the geography that Tommy Orange is writing about, whether it's BART or AC Transit or walking down the streets of Piedmont, right? And riding your bike throughout Oakland. Those were very familiar sort of concepts for me and really wonderful to see. And I think when I think about there, I think about it as like a love letter to the city, and more specifically, like a love letter to Oakland. And also, for sort of lack of a better term, maybe a critique as well. Because, something that's very prevalent in this text is either sort of violence from the past or violence as it occurs in the future and in the present. And that violence can be very real in the city, right? the very issue of violence being around you, and also the issue of trying to put food on the table, and maybe thinking of ways to do that aren't sort of traditional ways that we think of, right? And caring for your family and taking care of your family. These are all very real issues that are going on in the book. And in that way, I kind of see they're there as also responding to sort of understanding that this is like an Oakland story. This could have been a story that happened to a lot of different people within Oakland, maybe not necessarily Native people. Of course, we have that element, and we see this all culminating at the big Oakland powwow. But I think this is a story that a lot of folks from the East Bay can actually very much identify with. And in that sense, I think about the fact that, a lot of kids that I knew grew up in Oakland and experienced loss at a very young age. And perhaps that was to gun violence, that perhaps that was to substance abuse, right? And some of the larger sort of underlying themes that happen in this text, whether it's sexual violence or incarceration, these are things that a lot of people in the East Bay know very intimately, right? So that being said, I will say that I hope that readers are kind of careful not to essentialize this as like the only Native experience or the only urban Indian experience or even the only experience about Oakland in that sense too, because there's so many different stories that come out of the Bay Area alone. And I wouldn't want folks to think that this is like the one all be all. And the reality is that, the Native experience is very diverse, even regionally. Here in California, the Native experience is different from just Southern California to Northern California. And so I want to make sure that we all know that there cannot speak for all Native issues, and it cannot speak for all urban Indian issues for that matter. So if this is your first time sort of reading a text about Native issues, or even your second, I really urge you to read more so you can begin to hear other experiences that begin to contextualize what the Native experience is, here in the United States in particular. And there's several books that we can look to as well in Canada, or books from New Zealand that also have a very particular experience of Native issues as well. So I'm very excited to discuss this book. And one of the quotes I wanted to share with you all, which you've all read at this point, but one of the things that I really enjoy is thinking about how, urban Indian assimilation to urban centers, so whether that is Oakland or Chicago or Los Angeles, really was an attempt at assimilating Native people. And I looked at this text as like another element reifying the fact that urban Indians can in fact embrace the city and have embraced the city. So I just want to read a very quick little snippet from page 8. So right in the beginning, we're getting this from Tommy Orange, right? And it starts with hard, fast, just at the bottom of page 8. Getting us to cities was supposed to be the final necessary step in our assimilation, absorption, erasure, the completion of a 500-year-old genocidal campaign. But the city made us new, and we made it ours. And I love that. I mean, literally just reading that little sentence to you, that little bit gives me chills, because I think that's something that I know in my bones, that the city to me actually feels like home, that the sound of the BART tracks, right, feels like home. And I know now I'm in Santa Cruz, so it's very quiet here and I don't hear BART tracks anymore. But I think to really understand that urban Indian folks are in fact Native, whether you knew that or not, right? We are among, everybody in the city and in the suburbs and all of that. But that there's really wonderful embracing that's happening through things like Indian centers and powwows and socials and dinners. And all of these kinds of things are ways that we create and embrace community. And again, related back to my research, I think about the fact that in the 40s and the 30s, Native communities were coming together and having like Christmas dinners and putting on little events, for kids like Halloween parties. And we still have that to this day, virtually now because of the pandemic, but knowing that for sure, I think this book to me is also in a way sort of reiterating Indigenous futures and understanding that the city is a diverse, wonderful place, that it has, some elements of it that are very much talked about in this book and we'll discuss later. But I just love that particular sentence and part in the book. And it really is something that reminds me that, Indian land is in fact in the city. Quite literally, Indian land is everywhere. Let's remember that. but to think of the city, to think of the suburb even as like native land and a place where native communities can in fact thrive, right? So I'm very excited to be here. I'm so excited to hear from my fellow colleagues as well. And I will hand it back to you, Laura. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Next up, we have Mayanthi Fernando, who is an associate professor of anthropology here at UC Santa Cruz, where she is also the director of the Center for Cultural Studies, the interim provost of colleges 9 and 10, and the director of graduate studies for the anthropology department. Her research interests include multi-species worlds and relations between humans and non-humans, the body and the senses, Islam and secularism, liberalism and law, and gender and sexuality. Her first book, which was published in 2014, The Republic Unsettled, Muslim French and the Contradictions of Secularism, examines religion, politics, and citizenship in France. She's currently working on a second book on multi-species ecologies and more than human worlds. Welcome, Mayanthi.
Thank you, and hello everyone. And sorry, I was like jumping around. I have been on Zoom since 8 a.m. and I just realized that it's getting dark and I needed to get a light. So that's what I was doing when I was. So thank you to Laura and to THI and to Renya and Katie as well for joining me, and all of you who are here. I'm going to run this a little bit like a classroom in some ways. And so I have a PowerPoint, and I teach in the anthropology department. And so I want to focus this evening on a text that I actually often teach called The Storyteller by Walter Benjamin, a German philosopher who wrote in the kind of early 1900s and died fleeing the Nazis. And I want to focus on the storyteller and how it might help us to read and think more deeply about there. Because storytelling is not an art that is much practiced anymore certainly not by dominant communities in the West. And I do wonder though whether, and I sort of want to understand the book as a story and a set of stories, but Tommy Orange is a storyteller. And I'm curious about whether the art of storytelling is actually still practiced in Native communities. And there, I think Katie and Renya can help me out and maybe speak to this. But I see Tommy Orange, at least in reading him alongside Benjamin, in this much older, richer tradition of storytelling that Benjamin talks about. And so I think it might be helpful for us to kind of go through the Benjamin essay. So let me share my screen, and let me also, okay, so Benjamin writes that the art of storytelling is based on the exchange of experiences. And he says, the storyteller takes what he tells from experience, his own or that reported by others, and he in turn makes it the experience of those who are listening to his tale. And Benjamin contrasts the story with the novel, the storyteller with the novelist, and he writes that the birthplace of the novel is the solitary individual. After all, as he writes, the novel is usually dedicated to one hero, one odyssey, one battle. And in contrast, the reminiscences of the storyteller are dedicated to many diffuse, and I'm realizing that I somehow don't have this on the slide, to many diffuse occurrences. And so what I take from Benjamin is, what I take Benjamin to be saying in this sort of, this first part is that the story, in contrast to the novel, makes room for collectivity, for the collective experiences, right? And in hearing the story, the listener actually comes to share the experiences of another and is thereby connected to the person whose story the storyteller is telling. And so like I keep thinking about this in terms of there and the way that Tommy Orange weaves these multiple stories together into a web of stories, into a collective story. And I think Katie just spoke to that in a lot of ways, right? So it's not the story of the urban Indian as if it's like some essentialist story, but it is a story about a collective of some sort, right? A kind of a group, a set of people whom, Orange calls urban Indians. And so note how different there is from a conventional novel. We don't have one hero, one story, one kind of plot, one plot arc, right? We've got these multiple stories, all of them quite distinct, yet they all come together to tell the story of a place, Oakland, in fact, and a kind of a people, and I don't mean in a sort of a tribe kind of way, but a collective of some sort, right? A kind of collective experience. Benjamin also, and this is the second quote, Benjamin also contrasts stories to information, which is supposed to be, he says, understandable in itself. In other words, information is already shot through with explanation, he says, whereas half the art of storytelling is to keep a story free from explanation as one reproduces it, so that it is up to the reader to interpret things the way that he or she or they understands them. And thus the narrative, he says, achieves an amplitude that information lacks. And what I see Benjamin to be saying by this is that a story can travel. It has echoes because it is interpreted by the reader and the listener and then told again with yet another interpretation found by a second set of listeners or readers and so on. And in a way, a story has no owner, even though they are, right? The stories don't have an owner, even though the experiences a story tells are those often of an individual, the story, Benjamin wants to highlight, is a collective experience. It belongs to no one. And I thought about this as I read there. Whose story is it, right? We might ask that question, whose story is it? And it's not that it doesn't belong to anyone. It's the story of the set of, of urban Indians for Orange, but it doesn't belong to only one person. It's not about an individualized experience, which I think is really interesting and a really interesting. And I hesitate to call it a novel. You'll notice I keep calling it a book or text, but I'm not sure it's a novel because it sort of refuses the basic constraints of the modern Western novel. And so for what it's worth, this is the kind of thing, this is sort of how I think of ethnography, and I'm an anthropologist. When I do field work, I talk to lots of different people and I tell their stories in my book, but it's not simply a way to tell these individual stories of individual people. Through these individual stories, I try to tell a bigger story about the social, about the collective of some sort, the social world that they live in. And there's a moment in the book and in Dean's story that felt very familiar to me and to the kind of anthropology that I want to do and that I hope I'm doing. And so here Dean is explaining, so he's in front of the grant, the kind of grant committee, and he's kind of explaining what his project is. And he says, I want to bring something new to the vision of the Native experience as it's seen on the screen. We haven't seen the urban Indian story. What we've seen is full of the kinds of stereotypes that are the reason no one is interested in the Native story in general. It's too sad, so sad that it can't even be entertaining. But more importantly, because of the way it's been portrayed, it looks pathetic, but it makes me mad because the whole picture is not pathetic and the individual people and stories that you come across are not pathetic or weak or in need of pity. And there's real passion there and rage. And that's part of what I'm bringing to the project. And this is sort of how he frames his vision. And when I was reading that, and I think Laura, I'm trying to work a little bit of my own work in here, but I read that and I just thought, I work on Muslim France, and this is how I felt writing my book. I hated the way that Muslim French had been portrayed as fundamentalists, as terrorists, and as delinquents, and I wanted to tell a different story of Muslims as French, as citizens, as able to practice both Islam and citizenship, French citizenship, that was not a contradiction, right? To be Muslim and to be French is not a contradiction. In the same way, I think that for Orange, the story that Orange is telling, to be urban and to be Indian is not a contradiction. And so the difference, obviously, for me, the difference here is that in telling the story, Orange is also telling his own story, right? A story of his own passion and rage and a kind of complicated relationship to Indianness. And for me, I think it's a little bit more abstract in the sense that it's my complicated relationship to anthropology. And I'm happy to talk more about this, which is a deeply, deeply colonial discipline. And yet I think precisely because it focuses on the stories of people, it can do real critical work in a way that I think certain other disciplines cannot necessarily. And so back to Benjamin and also to there, and I'll put up another set of quotes here. So Benjamin also talks about the importance of what he calls memory to storytelling. And he doesn't simply mean our individual memory or the memorization of a story. He says, memory creates the chain of tradition which passes a happening on from generation to generation. It starts the web which all stories together form in the end. One ties onto the next. And I kept thinking about memory as well as I was reading There, There. And I want to take us to two moments from There, There that are also inflected by a kind of very Benjaminian understanding of memory, I think. First, again, is Dean's story, where he's talking about the Gertrude Stein quote from which the title of the book There, There is drawn. And he said, you know, and I mean, this is sort of in Dean's telling his story. The quote is important to Dean, this, there, there. He hadn't read Gertrude Stein beyond the quote, but for Native people in this country, all over the Americas, it's been developed over buried ancestral land, glass and concrete and wire and steel, unreturnable covered memory. There is no there, there. But then later, or actually earlier in the prologue, which is where Orange is ostensibly speaking in his own voice and talking about what it is to be an urban Indian, he writes, but what we are is what our ancestors did, how they survived. We are the memories we don't remember, which live in us, which we feel, which make us sing and dance and pray the way we do. Feelings from memories that flare and bloom unexpectedly in our lives, like blood through a blanket from a wound made by a bullet fired by a man shooting us in the back for our hair, for our heads, for a bounty, or just to get rid of us. And so I want to kind of juxtapose these this quote from Benjamin, this piece from Benjamin, and these two moments in Orange's There, There. And again, right, so for Benjamin, memory creates the chain of tradition, which passes a happening on from generation to generation. And I read Orange actually as thinking about memory, much as Benjamin does, and as stories passed down from generation to generation, creating memories not just in the mind, but also in the body. So memory is not something that an individual remembers, right? It's not necessarily based on something that happened to you, but rather it's a collective experience, again, something that lives on and flares and blooms unexpectedly, both as trauma and as joy, right? Both as fetal alcohol syndrome and as ceremony. And so there are these really interesting collective aspects of memory that I think Orange is really gesturing to. And then, you know, finally, this is Benjamin again, who says, the nature of every real story is that it contains, openly or covertly, something useful. The usefulness may, in one case, consist in a moral, in another, in some kind of practical advice, in a third, in a proverb or maxim. In every case, the storyteller is a man who has counsel for his readers. Counsel is less an answer to a question than a proposal concerning the continuation of a story which is just unfolding. And finally, Benjamin writes, there's no story for which the question as to how it continued would not be legitimate. In other words, for me, the story, unlike the novel, is always open-ended. Unlike a novel, it doesn't end. And I found this, we were talking about this earlier in the sort of green room, I found this to be the case in There, There. The ending, you know, is the shooting. And all the stories have ostensibly been leading up to this, but we finish the book with more questions than we have answers to, right? And the final scene feels almost like a story that was cut off midpoint. What happens to Orville? What happens to Blue and Jackie? What happens to Jackie and Harvey? You know, and the whole book has been building up to this moment, but this end is actually another beginning, or at the very least a kind of middle, a plot point, and I would say like a broader arc of Native life, and certainly Native life in Oakland. And so what I see both Benjamin and Orange doing is pointing out how stories connect the present to the past and also to the future. So stories often concern the past. They recount something that has happened, and they recount something that has happened, but the story is told in the present, and it is told, and this is the counsel part, right? It's told as a way of living the future better. And this is where the nature, I mean, this is what Benjamin means by, you know, the nature of every story is it's useful in some way, it provides counsel. And so like Native life itself, though There seemingly has this final scene of death and violence, it's actually not an end, but rather another step in the story that will continue to be told. So that is at least how I read the novel, through this kind of Benjaminian, essay called A Storyteller. So let me stop sharing my screen. If I can figure out how to do that. You would think after like a year of teaching on Zoom, I would have figured that out. So thank you. And then I'll turn it back over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. So our final speaker tonight will be Renya Ramirez. Renya Ramirez is an enrolled member of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, a professor of anthropology at UC Santa Cruz, and the author of 2 books, Native Hubs, which Katie gestured to before, Culture, Community, and Belonging in Silicon Valley and Beyond, which was published in 2007, and Standing Up to Colonial Power, The Lives of Henry and Elizabeth Bender Cloud, published in 2018. Her next book project is about the Native women of the Alcatraz occupation and afterwards. I will turn it over to Renya.
Hello, everybody. I got to share my screen. I actually want to honor a really good friend of mine who lived in Oakland and worked at the Native American Health Center. Her name was Janet King, and she recently passed away, maybe 10 days ago. And she was a warrior woman, an important member of the community. So I just want to say her name before I begin talking about this book, which is about the Oakland urban Native community. And so my talk it's called Tommy Orange, They're There, and the Hub. Sorry about that. So I'm gonna be connecting my research with analyzing this book, They're There. I wrote this book called Native Hubs, and the pivotal figure and the theorist of the hub is a woman, Laverne Roberts, a Paiute, and she was a founder of the American Indian Alliance, which was based in San Jose, California. So first I'm going to talk about her notion of the hub, and then I'm going to use it to analyze the book They're There. So according to Roberts, the city is like the hub of a wheel where urban natives gather, share community, culture, identity, and belonging, and that urban natives maintain connections to their reservations, pueblos, and rancherias through the spokes of the wheel. So this theorization of the hub came from an interview that I did of Laverne, and she's this notion of the hub is central to the book and how I organized the book. So here's just a kind of a pictorial representation of the hub. It's both a geographic concept and a virtual concept. So if you think about the hub as a geographic concept, it includes specific sites. So in an urban native community, there's cultural events, including powwows, sweat lodge ceremonies, family gatherings, meetings. There's a lot of places where natives gather living in the city. And it's also this virtual concept, which is not based in geographic space or location. So it includes emailing, memory sharing, storytelling, etc. So even though, Native people are living often, are living in a city and don't have a land base, they're able to maintain connections to, if they do have a land base, reservation, pueblo, or village, they can do that through this kind of virtual concept of storytelling, emailing, reading tribal newspapers, etc. So I'm talking about the book, They're There, where he uses this notion of the spider web. And so when I saw this idea of the spider web, I right away thought about Laverne Roberts' notion of the hub. And so it's, you know, it's very interesting because the way the book is organized, Native Hubs, is actually very similar to how Tommy Orange organizes his book. Laverne Roberts, as part of the American Indian Alliance, she organized these oral history telling sessions because the reason why she founded the American Indian Alliance was because there was a lot of tension and conflict within the urban Native community. And she wanted Native people to gain an understanding of each other across these differences. And so I organized the book with these oral history telling sessions of, you know, different Native people's lives. So similarly, Tommy Orange puts his character stories next to one another to support a spider web, a braiding of stories that are intertwined like a web. In the words of Jackie and Opal's mother, Vicky, spider webs are both homes and traps. So a trap would be addiction, you know, memory and ignorance, which threaten to ensnare them and keep them trapped like a spider web. As well as, you know, he also talks about webs of community, which are places to gather, connect, and heal. From Jackie's spider web tattoo to Orville's and Opal's experience with spider-infested sores on their legs, spiders and spider webs are throughout the book. So more about spider webs. When Jackie Redfeather is at a substance abuse center and newly sober, 11 days, and was struggling to remain so, she thinks about drinking bottles of alcohol in the motel refrigerator, and she looks at the spider web tattoos on her feet. She remembers her mother's speech about homes and traps and successfully avoids drinking. The substance abuse meeting was a web of community, a place to heal. She no longer wanted to live trapped by alcohol and refuses to acquiesce to alcohol's cravings. So more on spider webs. Jackie's grandson, Orville Redfeather, encounters spider imagery. Banned by his great aunt and caregiver, Opal, from learning about or participating in Native traditions, 14-year-old Orville has turned to the internet, a Native hub, to learn about his tribal history and to study Native dance to prepare for an Oakland powwow, a pan-tribal hub. As the powwow approaches, Orville becomes bothered by an itchy sensation in the lump on his leg that he's had for as long as he can remember. When he picks at the lump, he pulls out several spider legs out of it. The spider legs symbolize his emergence into adulthood and his emerging sensitivity to the mysteries, coincidences, and stories all around him. Another Native hub and spider web metaphor. He is beginning to make a home in his Native community, a pan-tribal hub and a spider web, a place where Opal warned him could ever be a trap. So there's also storytelling, a Native hub and spider web. Orange uses his characters to show how storytelling and memory are indispensable parts of Native American culture and tradition. The most passionate storyteller is Denny Oxydine, an aspiring filmmaker who wants to carry on the project of his uncle Lucas that he failed to finish during his lifetime by gathering the stories of urban Native Americans who make up the urban Native Oakland community, a pan-tribal hub. Dean is desperate to collect these stories as a way of asserting his community's resilience and rich history, and tells the story tells the people he interviews that he doesn't care what kind of story they tell, long, short, happy, or sad, as long as it provides a window into how they experience being Native and being from or living in Oakland. So there's a lot of strengths about this book. It's incredibly well written and compelling. It's semi-autobiographical. Orange writes about Oakland Native community, great weaving of multiple urban Native character stories and metaphor of the spider web, excellent and powerful discussion of missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's a very powerful story in the book. There's parts where I wanted more. I wanted Tommy Orange to include California Native characters and or colonial history of the California missions. He describes the Native occupation of Alcatraz, including young natives drinking. I wanted more discussion of the strengths of Alcatraz, such as Big Rock School, clinic, and other elements of the history of Alcatraz occupation. There's lots of emphasis of historical trauma and problems that result, such as addiction, lack of cultural connection, violence, etc. I wanted more about healing from colonialism and strength of urban Native culture and community. Maybe all these things are what are going to be included in the next book. Because I felt like this was kind of like, maybe this is part one. And there's going to be a whole nother book. And I look forward to another excellent book by Tommy Orange. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renya. So we'd like to open it up for questions now. So you're welcome to put questions in the chat, or you're welcome to ask questions.
Hi, everybody. First, I just wanted to thank Mayanthi, Katie, and Renya. I learned so much from this, and I really appreciate your point of views on the novel. I did want to say, as a writer and professor of creative writing, that I really strongly do think that there is a novel. And when I heard that, I was just quickly scribbling down many novels with multiple perspectives, just from the Native American literary tradition, Louise Erdritz's Love Medicine, Leslie Marmon Silko's Almanac of the Dead, and then there's so many more, Americana, The God of Small Things, 2666, The Emigrants, Brief Wondrous Slice of Oscar Wilde. One thing I did notice, though, is that many of those novels are by people of color, and that's maybe something, I haven't thought about that, but that's maybe something interesting to think more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mika, no, I think that's absolutely right. And so when I say like the modern novel, I mean the kind of modern bourgeois novel, right, that emerges out of a very kind of North Atlantic European tradition. And I think that's exactly, I mean, I think you sort of, I think we're both in some ways, so when I say it's not a novel, I mean in that kind of very classical, like 19th century bourgeois novel sort of way. And it's not really, it's not about the sort of internal life of someone, right? Like there's this, it's a very different kind of book. And I'm not tied to not calling it a novel. We can call it a novel, but I do think that there's something really interesting, as you just pointed out, that many of the works that have a much more kind of collective approach both to space and time are, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call them non-Western because they're writers who are, for the most part, like have come up in the North Atlantic, but I think I would be interested to know whether they're also drawing on a different set of literary traditions and kind of writerly traditions and storytelling traditions. But I take your point. I mean, it was slightly polemic, but
Also, I'm interested. It's interesting to think about there too as not a novel about a single internality, but actually each perspective is so kind of deeply internal and introspective, which is one of the things I really love about the novel, because we get to know each of them in a really internal way. Curious what other people are.
What do you think? What do you think's at stake in the distinction? Like, what do you think is most at stake?
For me, is that
or Mika too? Like in the.
I think for me, I mean, I don't have a lot of at stake other than to try to think about this is different from. I mean, it's also there. It's not different from a series of kind of post-colonial novels, right? But it is different from, again, a very like a sort of conventional under like a kind of conventional story of one or two people. And I think for me, what's at stake is the way that he really, I read him as telling a story that is not, I mean, I'm, as much as whether it's a novel or not, I also want to think about whether it's fiction or not, right? And I think that's, to me, as in some ways a more interesting question than whether this is a novel or not, because I think that there, and it's an interesting text because there's the prologue and the interlude that are ostensibly, you know, true historical fact, right? So it mixes these two in this really interesting way, but it mixes them in a way that seems to suggest that there's a distinction between the stories and then the prologue and the interlude. So there's like this kind of separation. They're called different things, and yet they are foundational to the telling the story. I mean, Mika, I would be really curious to hear what you make of that kind of delineation, seeming delineation, but not really.
Well, I love this provocation, Mayanthi, because it makes me realize my own kind of deep attachment to those, you know, to the novel, in that I want to argue that the novel is a really capacious genre that can kind of, almost anything that you say is a novel is a novel. And so, and kind of similarly with the idea of fiction, that if someone says it's fiction, even if everything happened is absolutely true. So that's probably my attachment to it. My like kind of wanting to insist that the novel is a big tent that can hold so many different kinds of writing. And I loved that. If I had to pick, I might almost say that the prologue and interlude were my favorite parts of the book, just because of that, because it was such a break from exactly what you're talking about, Mayanthi. I hadn't seen that before, and I thought, yeah, of course you can do this. It was great to see, just to see something new. It surprised me, and also each of those voices were different. So I was just so excited to see this new thing that I hadn't seen very much before.
I know we have had a hand up for a long time. Sorry. And I don't see a name there. Kuhak at Comcast? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anna, and we live on the campus. My husband's an astronomer, and I worked for many, many years for EPA, working with Native American tribes, trying to ensure that they had environmental protection and the capability and all of that. Kind of two questions and I apologize, I got in late. For the first speaker, you mentioned Piedmont, and growing up in the East Bay, Piedmont is a very shishi, wealthy area. It's not Oakland, Fruitvale, that area. So I'm just curious how that kind of connected in your mind with the story. And then the other question for everybody, I would love to get astronomers more engaged in this on the campus, people from the other side of the brain, and, kind of how do we do that? And how do we gauge in the community?
So I can respond to the first part of your question in thinking about Piedmont. So I had brought up briefly that part of how I come into this book is about my own personal research that was related to something called the Bay Area Outing Program that funneled Native women from Western-based boarding schools to serve as live-in housemaids in the Bay Area. And so actually a lot of them were concentrated in Piedmont, as you had mentioned, a very affluent area. So that's where they come in. But there are scenes throughout the book where they're walking on Piedmont, for example, Piedmont Avenue in Oakland. And so that was just me kind of connecting to the terrain and understanding, all the scenes and where things are happening. So it was more so, I think, me being able to visualize visualize those areas, as probably you were too, right, growing up in the East Bay. So that's kind of how it comes into the story. And I'll invite the other question to be taken up by the fellow panelists about bringing sort of astronomers into the conversation.
Renya, do you want
to say something? And that's just on Piedmont and Piedmont Avenue. The thing that is incredible to me about the book, I Live in Oakland, is just how it's rooted in Oakland. That's what Katie was saying. And it's, to me, the most remarkable thing about the book. If you live in Oakland, I've been telling everybody that lives there, they've got to read the book. And one thing is that when you say Piedmont in the book, it isn't about the wealthy community, but it's about Piedmont Avenue. And that's an area that all kinds of people go from the flatlands to the upper because there are shops, bars, and it's just a browsing, intermixing area. And so it's a very important part of the book.
I'm not sure about the question about the astronomers. I need more
Can you
clarification.
say a little bit? Yeah, can you say why astronomy?
Well, my husband's an astronomer, but it's kind of a two-part. One is how do we, people in the Santa Cruz community, connect better with the issues that are being raised? That's one question. The other is for the campus. I mean, I love seeing this community from the humanities, but you know, how do we bridge with the sciences? Are there connections that could be made? So it's not, I mean, I go to this and I see kind of one group from the university. I don't see another part of the university. Is there a way to kind of bring them together, to support, to do partnerships, that sort of thing?
Laura, you want to? I mean, can I be slightly provocative? Why do you think they're not here? Why do we have to go get them? Why can't they just come to us?
Well, that's a good question.
I mean, I say that somewhat polemically, as you can tell.
No, a great question. I mean, my right now my husband's on a Zoom. He and his colleague Sandy Faber have been doing a huge project with the Hispanic community from Santa Cruz down to Soledad to encourage students, high school students, to do astronomy and link with the family, support them, But, you know, I find that when I go on these Zooms for the university, that it's sort of a, you know, you kind of get one group and then you get another group. And it'd be great to see some way of, I don't know if they need to be invited to give a I don't know, but I see too much kind of separation.
There's something interesting going on in the chat that I want to read. It's a thing about the, I think the recent Mauna Kea observatory struggle may have illuminating lessons for the connection between the sciences / astronomy / universities and indigenous struggles over land rights. So basically there are this observatory on Hawaiian indigenous land, and this is like a ceremonial location, and so that there's an issue there. If you think about the Amamutsin, who are the local indigenous people, and their struggle over a quarry, you know, so that's kind of an issue that shows that there can be tensions between you know, development, environmental studies, indigenous people, the use of land for indigenous land for observatories. So those are all issues where astronomers could get involved and talk to indigenous people about those issues.
Right, that's such a good point. I was just going to point out too, I mean, the class that I'm teaching on Tell Me Orange now is, I mean, students are coming from all disciplines. And one of my students, Sophia, hi Sophia, just put in the chat, that she's studying earth and planetary sciences and is here. And, we've been studying Tommy Orange in the context of Native American literature this quarter. So I think maybe it's not exactly true that we're not already here, I guess, to sort of speak to Mayanthi's point. And maybe in ways but maybe it's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting point that you're bringing up. And maybe it's something that we can make more visible, or that needs to be made more visible, to the broader community, the interdisciplinarity of, the discussion that we're already having. I know, Amy, you've had your hand up for a long time, and there are some good questions in the chat too. So why don't we go to your question, Amy, and then I'll pick up some that are in the chat.
Yes, thank you. And I want to thank the panelists for a really engaging discussion on the book. And I'd first like to begin by responding to Mayanthi's questions regarding storytelling within Indigenous communities. And I was really struck as I was listening to you by the words of Leslie Marmon Silko, who really discusses their centrality in our community. The book Ceremony opens with the beautiful words about the importance of story, and that we have nothing if we don't have the stories. They are everything that we have in our communities. And I think of the very, very rich literary tradition of Native American authors that Tommy Orange is a part of. We talk about the Native American Renaissance in literature, that really kind of begins with the work of N. Scott Momaday, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1969. So there have been multiple generations of Indigenous people that are writing in the storytelling traditions of their respective communities. So Tommy Orange is part of a rich, and now, of course, he's part of that younger generation. But also I'm really struck by, and I'd recommend the work of Joellen Archambault, who writes about Indigenous story work. And she herself worked in the Coast Salish communities. And she argues in her scholarship that Indigenous oral narratives are an important source for and component of Coast Salish knowledge systems. And stories are not only to be recounted and passed down, they are also intended as tools for teaching. And so again, she kind of advances this term of story work that I think many people who are writing from a decolonizing perspective employ. And, just again, the definition of Indigenous story work as it has evolved has come to encompass the sheer breadth of ways in which Indigenous storytelling serves as a historical record, as a form of teaching and learning, and as an expression of Indigenous culture and identity. But such traditions have too often been relegated to the realm of myth and legend, recorded as fragmented distortions or erased altogether. So this work, as I said, is really important as we think about the importance of Indigenous storytelling traditions and the work that stories do within our community. So I highly recommend it, and I hope you can see it. And then I have a follow-up question for Renya. You mentioned in your presentation the representation of Alcatraz. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on, that particular section of the novel and what maybe you were hoping that Tommy Orange would touch on.
Well, since I've been doing this next book project, researching about Alcatraz women on Alcatraz, my mother who lived on the island during the Alcatraz occupation. And in Tommy Orange's book, he touches on it very briefly, but he mostly is just talking about, how these young people are drinking and there's violence that happens there on the island. And what I was missing, which would have been tapping into some of the history of what happened on Alcatraz, which included Alcatraz women building a health clinic, founding the school for the young people on the island, the meetings that happened on the island. There was actually a lot of people there who became empowered on the island. My mother was there. She was empowered while she was on Alcatraz. So the representation of Alcatraz to me felt too negative, that there needed to be some more of the strength of what the urban Indian community, what was happening as part of the occupation of Alcatraz. So that's just an example of, you know, when you're writing anything, it's always good to honor some of the strength of urban Native communities. So that's just an example of that, where I wished he had touched on, you know, even a description of Big Rock School, which was this amazing school for the children on the island where they actually learn Native history and Native perspectives. And so it was, you know, a very exciting place.
And Renya, I wonder
Amy,
if I could also, oh, sorry, you were talking, Amy, sorry.
No, go ahead, Katie.
Oh, that was you, Mayanthi. Sorry, I was like wondering who was. I just wanted to say that I've heard that critique before, actually, Renya. I've heard people say, I hope people don't walk away from this book and think that's all that Alcatraz was about. And I think that was partially why I was, you know, arguing for us not to essentialize this story, because while this is a story that, you know, maybe could have happened in some time, some place, maybe not necessarily even in Alcatraz, but in some movement, you know, I think we do have to talk about those more positive stories and maybe dig a little bit deeper into that history. And I think that's where I would urge people to expand, you know, their knowledge of the things that are coming up in this book. So it's not just that one sort of picture. So I just wanted to say that I have heard that before, Renya, and I agree that there could be room to really discuss further. And so that's where your book is coming in through, though. So I'm very excited about that too, because you offer that perspective, right?
Well, and the other thing that I missed, since we're talking about, that's why I want there to be part 2. I want Tommy Orange to write part 2, because what I missed is something that's been theorized about, you know, the Oakland Native community, is this idea of clan mothers. That as part of the Oakland Native community, there are these clan mothers who are these powerful warrior women who are the backbone of the Native community, that are like part of the Intertribal Friendship House, the American Indian, you know, the various organizations. There's this book that is called Urban Voices, and it was written by Susan Lobo. And so my very good friend that I wanted to talk about and acknowledge, Janet King, she was a clan mother. She was my college roommate, and you know, so this is what I missed in the book, is these amazing, powerful Native clan mothers who are very much part of the Oakland urban Native community that I felt was missing in the book. So I'm just hoping that Tommy Orange does a part 2 where he can actually bring out some of this history and this really strength of urban Native communities. So thank you.
Or someone else, right? I mean, I think what we're having a conversation about, and Renya, what you're really pointing up, is the way in which, you know, the lack of Native authors, right, of Indigenous authors, that, you know, I mean, I think Amy just really nicely laid out a whole tradition, but there's still few and far between. This is not a kind of mainstream voice, right? And so what that does is it puts a real burden of representation on a single author that I think is just really, I mean, I think it's understandable, but I think it's also really unfair. Not you, Renya, I don't think you're being unfair, but I think structurally it produces this demand, right, on an author like Tommy Orange to tell the whole story, to tell every part of the story, to make sure he leaves nothing out, to make sure, you know, he represents the community well, right? And that's not asked of non-white authors. It's just not. And you know, that's really problematic. And and you know, Mika is saying in the chat, it's an impossible ask. because you cannot sort of give the whole representation. And it's something that I mean, I'm talking about it now because it's something that I write about in my own work, is this, that's part, that's the kind of double bind, right, of being of being a minoritized voice, of being a Native voice, of being an African American novelist, of being a South Asian. I mean, there was a time when the post-colonial novel was like supposed to say everything about the post-colonial condition, and it can't, right? It can't. And so exactly the danger of a single story. And so on the one hand, yes, I think it's incumbent upon us who read this book not to essentialize, right? And I think that's Katie's point. This is not the story of urban Indians. It's not even the story of Alcatraz, right, as Renya is pointing out. But I think we equally can't demand, no one can tell the whole story, right? And so, and I just want to, it's such a difficult, I think it must be such a difficult position to be in for an author like Tommy Orange, where like, yeah, Katie, you're muted, but yeah, it's, and I'm sure that the indigenous authors who came before him, as Amy just invoked, people made the same sort of impossible demands on them too. And it's a structural position. That's what's so difficult about it. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, but.
Well, I just want to add something that I want to make kind of clear, which I'm going to follow up with Amy Lonetree's talking about, is that there's been generations of Native authors and novelists like Leslie Marmon Silko and Scott Momaday, Sherman Alexie. There's been generations of these authors, and that actually, I'll just give an example. Sherman Alexie was taken to task by Elizabeth Cook Lynn, and basically was saying he was being too negative and needed to include more of the strength of urban or Native community. So this has actually been a long trajectory of discussion about because and the reason why I want to bring this context is often the stereotypes of urban natives are that we are alcoholic, we're stuck in the Indian bars, we're on Skid Row, we're super poor. Like if you look at the representation of urban natives, it's this very gritty, that we're in the middle of a lot of problems. And so when we do representations, we always have to think about how are we representing ourselves. And so, I think Tommy Orange went to AEIA, which is in Santa Fe. So I'm sure there was discussion around these issues. So I'm just trying to bring up, like Gerald Visner talks about the importance of survivance, that yes, we talk about, the problems, the struggles, historical trauma, all those things, but we always have to balance with survivance, resilience. So this is like a generations long dialogue that I'm talking about. So I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
I think if I could add to, I agree with all of your points, Renya. And I think, we as academics, when we think about our writing, we think about typically a larger audience, or at least a field, people who are kind of on board and see sort of what we're doing. And a lot of times when I've heard Tommy speak about this book, he says that he wrote it for a Native audience. And so I think part of that maybe explains why certain things are in it, and specifically why certain things aren't. And I think that also means, it's a question of, if Native authors write stories, are they going to have to explain sort of every bit of it to an audience who maybe doesn't know that experience? Do you understand what I'm saying? So I'm just kind of thinking about, if I wrote something that I thought only Native people would read, it would be very different than if I thought of a larger, audience that included non-Native folks. And maybe I would do something that didn't include maybe the best elements of something that we know is a very powerful movement. I mean, thinking about Alcatraz is part of the reason why I even have a job to this day, right? Why like Native American Studies centers exist, like why Native American, studies departments exist. So there's a very long tradition, but I think in thinking about what didn't make the book, it reminds me that it actually started as something that was sort of meant just for Native eyes, if you will. So that's something that I think about when I think about sort of what isn't in the particular novel.
Good point, everybody. Thank you.
Sort of to segue with this there, Angela, Elsie, you had a question about the structure of the book. Do you want to ask?
Yes, I was partly because of the discussion about story and how this is this a story or is this a novel? And it's a story in the sense that it's so open-ended, but it does seem odd. There's a prologue and interlude, but no epilogue. That, so of course, some of us were saying, but what happened to Orville and what happened to Jackie? Did she get to meet her daughter? All those questions we have. So just wondering what happened to that epilogue.
Good question. Who wants to take that one? Where's the epilogue?
I think he wanted to leave us hanging. He's writing part 2. That's what I think. I think he's like, I just want everyone to go, what happened to these people? And there's going to be part 2.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I kind of want to hear also, Mayanthi, what you were talking about, sort of thinking about the form of it, right? And I don't know, I'm kind of curious too, because you talked about how this ending is really not an ending, and it's sort of like a beginning and what really happens. And it's, in a way, it's up to the readers, at least at this point for sure, because we don't necessarily have a book 2 yet, right? But I know what I think happened in my mind, but I'm curious to hear what everybody else thought about what happened. I think usually this is also my wishful thinking of, well, I hope this happened, you know, because we don't even know what the doctor says, right? So there's a lot up in the air.
Right. Yeah, when I first read the ending, I actually didn't like it because it just ended so abruptly. I was again saying this, you know, I was like looking for the next chapter almost. Like I was like, wait, acknowledgments, what? But then as I started to think about it more, I really appreciated the fact that he doesn't really close, right? Like there's a kind of, there's this build up, and literally like a series of explosions. And yeah, Anita is saying the ending kind of picks up speed, right? And then it's like, boom. And then the pieces start to kind of fall, but he ends as they're falling midair almost. And I now that I've been thinking about it a little bit more, I think it's an amazing ending because it's in some ways not an ending. And that's why I was trying to evoke this notion of the story as not having an end. And in some ways, in part because you take from it what you will in some way, right? It's Katie, like you continue the story yourself. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that I would want Orange to write the next episode. I want him to write another book, but I don't, but I'm not sure I want that like part 2, because I personally really liked the way that he refused to kind of give us a closing. I don't know but I'm curious what other people thought. That was just kind of my impression.
Can I just say, I feel a little bit like Renya was saying, there's so much negativity, and you know, I've only read a couple other Native books. I don't have perspective on it, but I think maybe I felt like every single person in this family, the father was missing, someone was on drugs or alcoholic or got killed, or this person. And I think I just sort of felt like, could we please have some good news here? So I think that I also felt at the end, I said, really, that's the end? And I don't feel like necessarily super optimistic because there was so much other terrible tragedies in these families. So I kind of felt like, can we please have something, you know, good happen? And I certainly hope if he writes a sequel, it doesn't take him as long as it took Margaret Atwood to write Testaments, because wow.
You know, I think that's a really good question about where's like where's the kind of light at the end of the tunnel, in a sense, right? And I think it was very much his choice to not give you that as a reader, to say, maybe you want, you know, some happy, fun, you know, beautiful ending, and I'm not going to give it to you. And we were talking about this kind of in the green room sense. And there was folks who said that, I know I've heard him talk about the fact that he wrote part of that scene as like the water protectors are being pelted with bullets and water, you know, in North Dakota, right, at the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so violence also is very much a part of sort of the beginning of the book and sort of thread throughout. So in a way, he also prepared us in a sense for this big thing is going to happen. So when it was happening, I was listening to this as an audiobook when I was like driving in New Zealand, and I was literally dropping my car off at the Auckland airport, and everything was happening so fast. And I was like crying as I'm driving on the left side of the road. But it was a very, for me, sad moment, and also something expected in a sense too, I think. So anyway, I'm just thinking about, we all want like a good, happy ending, and he wasn't necessarily going to give that to us. And I don't know if book 2, if there even is going to continue the story. I think I actually kind of agree with Mayanthi that maybe I don't want, you know, because in my mind, like for instance, I need, Orville has to live. Edwin has to live. Like I need all that to happen. And so right now it's happening for me. And, you know, I want to, I'm going to invite this question also to Renya, if you have any thoughts on this, but that's a really good point.
Well, the way I looked at the book was, I mean, I thought about Almanac of the Dead, of Leslie Marmon Soko's Almanac of the Dead, where, I mean, it's like 700 pages. And oh my God, it is painful. You are really looking at colonialism front and center. You're looking at capitalism front and center. I mean, it's pretty intense. It's a super intense book. So when I was reading this book, what I kept feeling was this was like dealing with historical trauma. I don't know if people have heard of this idea of historical trauma, but it's this idea of how colonization impacts Native communities, and that it, you know, when you've gone through colonization, whether it's the federal boarding schools, the federal relocation program, the outing program, all these like colonial, you know, this colonial legacy, it impacts Native communities in the sense of, you know, we've got murdered and missing Indigenous women. We've got, you know, Native people dealing with being in gangs. We've got, I mean, we've got a lot. Alcoholism, drugs. We have all these things that are really the legacy of colonization. So it felt like on the one hand, he was dealing with us really looking at, you know, all this, the impact of colonization, but then filtered through it is the reality of urban Native community and the positive aspects, the storytelling, the Indian center, the powwow. So there was definitely elements of both. And I'll just say the ending, I mean, both Katie and Mayanthi have this much more positive experience of the ending. For me, I just did not like the ending. I did not, I mean, I'm a grandmother. I have gray hair. So when I got to the ending and there's all this killing and it's a shootout scene and a powwow, for me, that's like horrible violence that I hope to God never happens at a powwow. Because for me, a powwow is ceremony. It's healing. It's gathering. It's people making jokes. It's people eating fry bread. It's, you know, like I have all these wonderful memories of these powwows. And so for him to bring in the shootout scene, you know, I think it was Laura was saying that he was influenced by Tarantino, and, you know, showing this kind of shootout scene as part of this powwow, for me, it was incredibly painful. and very difficult. And I had a really hard time with it. So I'm just being honest. And I'm like, is that because of, because I'm a grandmother and I see POWs in a certain way, and I was raised to see POWs in a certain way, and then bringing in this shootout scene for me, it's just like ripping apart my idea of a powwow. Maybe so. Maybe that's what it is. And maybe I need to be more open. But I'm just being honest that for me, it was very difficult. And I had a really hard time reading it. So I'm just being honest there.
No, I appreciate that. And when I think of powwows, I definitely think of nothing but a positive, happy experience, like really good fry bread, seeing people you haven't seen in a while, like saying hello, very much, that kind of connection that we see. And I think, though, at the same time, what you're speaking of Renya right now is really culminating this sort of history of violence, that violence can be learned and then violence can in fact be reproduced. And we're talking about, young men in a community that really see themselves as kind of getting theirs. We want that $50,000 at the powwow. And I mean, how many times, if we can think about stories of like young men in a city who are just trying to take care of their family, who are just trying to, put food on the table. So of course, I see sort of that desperation and that need, right? And I'm so sad that it happens at a powwow. And then at the same time, I was like, I saw this coming, and it doesn't make it any better, right? It doesn't make it any better, and it still is very heart-wrenching. But yeah, I see that, though, what you're talking about, really this kind of violence that really bookends really the book. You really see that throughout.
There have been several questions about the meaning of, or the message of the violence, and some comments too. I mean, Akira, would you mind sharing how you're reading the end? I think it's interesting.
Sorry, my mic was off. I found, when reading the book, and especially going back to it earlier today, that the ending of this story shows up many times throughout the book. All of the characters go through this sort of same investment in someone's story, in their own story, in their history, and then it is cut short by some violence. And the tragic part of the book is that violence is often the people in their community. And it's because of the situations that they've been put in and the terrible conditions that they're forced to be in, that violence is perpetuated, and it injures everybody in the community. And they don't have the luxury of asking for a sequel. They don't have the luxury of saying, well, what happens? Because the story just ended right there. The person got shot right in front of them. So they have to live with that burden of knowing this story, having like a personal involvement in this story, and trying to move on from it, carrying what that story means and what that person meant to them, and moving on and living their life. So I think that the ending is very purposeful in how it cuts off very quickly. And I think it's masterfully done. I think it's really well done. And I think it's the perfect way to end a story like this, because it really, it forces you to sit with what you just read and think about the ending.
Yeah, that was beautifully put. And I think someone in the chat also just said something that I was going to point out, which is that violence it's like, I mean, it's all around us. I think it would be almost strange. I don't know. It was devastating. The end was just absolutely devastating, precisely for the reasons I think that Akira just laid out, which is that we get attached, particularly to certain characters, right? And I mean, Orville, I think, is, that character, and it just, I mean, I I sat there for a long time, kind of just grappling with the reality of that violence, and especially in a place like the United States. So Renya, I mean, I obviously can't speak to the your sense of violence. I mean, I think, yeah, I do think in some ways it's a devastating ending. It's a devastating moment, and you know, it sort of leaves you. It left me kind of without any. It left me completely numb in a way. Actually, like I didn't have a reaction for a little while, and then I had a reaction. So that's why I was curious about, you know, other folks' responses to that.
Well, we have a hand raised. Would you like to ask our final question?
Thank you for all of you. I mean, this has been, I've read the book through 2 groups twice, and this has been amazing. So for each of you, which book should we pick up next to continue this understanding, this journey?
Good question.
I say any book by Leslie Marmon Silko. She's my absolute favorite. She's just brilliant. I love everything she writes. It's just absolutely amazing. So any book by Leslie Marmon Silko. I also really like Greg Sarris. He wrote this amazing book, Mabel McKay, which is incredibly powerful. He actually does a book called Grand Avenue, which is actually about urban natives. And there's actually a short film. It's called Grand Avenue. But he also did this other book, Watermelon Nights. And the reason why I mention him is because he's California native. And this is something that I think is missing in this book by Tommy Orange, is there's really no representation of the California native experience. So I would say, you know, Leslie Marmon Silko, you know, and Greg Sarris would be great things to read.
I plan to pick up, when I haven't read it, but I plan to pick up the book that Amy Lone Tree recommended, Indigenous Story Work by Joanne Archibald. So thank you, Amy.
I'm going to recommend 2 books. The first one is Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda. It's a memoir. It actually takes up this very same question of the history of violence, particularly as it relates to missionization here in California and for mission Indians. Excellent California Indian perspective. Really love that book. And humor is also a big part of that as well. And I think we can all agree there's some humor in there. And the second book I want to recommend is We Had a Little Real Estate Problem. This is the unheralded story of Native comedy. Everybody wants to laugh right now, right? After we've talked about that final scene. Please pick up that book. It just dropped. It's Simon & Schuster. And this is where you can start to see really contemporary positivity, you know, laughing, funny. I mean, it's really wonderful and tells the story of many Native comics nowadays, as well as Charlie Hill. So just want to put those out there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to let everyone know too that we're going to compile a list of sort of further reading, and we'll send that out after Tommy visits. So we'll have more than even these, and I'll get the titles and authors for everyone, so it's clear. Well, thank you so much. Our time is unfortunately up. Thank you to Katie, to Renya, to Mayanthi, and to all of you for coming. Please join us tomorrow at the salon with the Amamutsu Tribal Band. We'll be talking about all of these issues and more. And to Tommy Orange's visit, of course, March 3rd.
Send the link for the Amamutsu event as well.
Say that again, Renya?
Send us the link for the Amamutsu event as well.
I'll do it. I'll do it
Thank
for sure.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a good night, everyone.